heart of a debate that will change the destiny of Britain. Stay or go. Tonight, as the arguments intensify, two men with different visions of the future of the European Union are live before a studio audience. The battle lines are drawn on the biggest political decision of a lifetime.
Good evening. There are now just 16 days to go before the UK makes a momentous decision to stay in or to leave the European Union. David Cameron called this referendum as Prime Minister and wants us to remain. Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party, has spent his political life campaigning to get out. Over the course of the next hour, both men are going to be quizzed by our studio audience. First up this evening is Nigel Farage. Welcome, Mr. Farage.
Thank you.
Our first question, we'll go straight to it, is from Daniel Green this evening.
Mr. Farage, the majority of the UK's top economists and business leaders believe that leaving the EU has a significant risk of economic decline and potentially even a recession. I don't see what I, as a member of the public, stand to gain from this outcast.
Well, it's a funny thing, that's what got me into politics in the first place. 25 years ago, we had a government backed up by the TUC, backed up by all the so-called expert economists who said, and by the way, Mr. Cameron, who at the time actually worked in the Treasury, and they took us into something called the exchange rate mechanism, where they pegged the level of sterling against the Deutschmark. I, at the time, was working in the commodities business, but also was trading currencies. I thought the whole thing was stone bonkers. Within 2 years, all the experts had been proved wrong. We had record business bankruptcies and record house repossessions. Then 10 years went by and the euro came along. And 15 years ago, the very same people were all saying to us, but if you don't join the euro, then I'm afraid foreign and direct investment into Britain will cease, the City of London will close, terrible things will happen to you. Well, all I can say is thank God we didn't join the euro. And now this same gang, who it seems to me have been wrong about everything, through this process of groupthink, and because in many cases, although they masquerade as being independent, they're actually being paid by the government or paid by the taxpayer, are telling us terrible things would happen to us outside of the European Union. Can I just say this one thing to you? That they've been wrong before and they're wrong again. There are strong, independent voices in business. You know, people like John Longworth from the British Chambers of Commerce, who resigned his position to speak out against this, and people like Digby Jones, the former Director General of the CBI. So the trend is, if they're currently in post, they support the status quo. Once they've retired or resigned, the former Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, then they speak more freely. I would just say this to you, trade is not made by governments, trade is not made by bureaucrats, Daniel, it's made by people like you. You buy products. You choose to buy a product or you don't. And do you know what? Once we've divorced ourselves amicably from political union, we will then go on buying cars and wine and trading happily.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Daniel, for that question. We're going to stay with questions on the economy and go to a gentleman not far away. Aaron Barsley has a question for Mr. Farage.
Hello. I work in the pharmaceutical industry with multinationals who are worth billions to our economy. They're here because we're in the EU. Do you think our independence is going to risk thousands of jobs and billions of annual income to our economy?
Well, I don't buy the fact that a pharmaceutical company is in Britain because we're in the EU. They're in Britain because they want to be in Britain.
I'm going to interrupt you there.
And there are lots of reasons for doing that.
Some operations can only be done in the EU. I can't do my job in Switzerland, so I can't review some EU products and live in Switzerland. You have to be in the EU, and that's why they have EU headquarters in the UK, which makes it worth 32.4 billion a year.
I have to say that I'm not wholly happy with the way that much of the pharmaceutical industry has behaved. In particular, I see their lobbying in Brussels, which is absolutely massive. And I see the way they've been very good at putting out of business people producing alternative medicines. So not everything your industry has done has been good.
Proved against placebo.
But
They put
look,
themselves out
I've
of it.
heard these
That's completely
arguments
off track.
about
Stick to
car
pharmaceuticals,
manufacturers.
please.
I've heard these arguments about car manufacturers. I hear all these arguments that people are only here because we're in the EU. Well, do you know what? We have in this country actually rather a big domestic market. And just to give you a sense of perspective, right? Only 12% of the entire British economy, 12% is exports to the European Union. The other 88%.
Question is specifically about pharmaceuticals. Sorry.
And also about jobs too.
32.4 billion 2004 report from the government.
Yeah.
Right, so get that round your head. 32.4 billion. Now, the European Medicines Agency is in London. It's all the medicines, all the groundbreaking ones for the whole of Europe are reviewed in London, and Brussels listens to us. You can't do that if you're not part of Europe. Yes.
I'm sorry. This is entirely and utterly false.
Full stop.
Whether you're based in London, you know, I mean, for example, our biggest industry isn't pharmaceuticals. Our biggest industry by a mile is, of course, financial services of all kinds. You know, from stocks and shares to pensions to hedge funds, you name it. It's our biggest industry. It brings our biggest revenues, and all of that has been transferred to agencies that are scattered around the rest of Europe.
We've had plenty on Mr. Vazi's question. Thank you very much. We're going to stay with these issues, though, and go to Heather Reeves, who has another question for Ms. Farage. Heather.
Mr. Farage, if we leave, we may find ourselves punished or financially crippled to set examples for other EU countries that wish to leave the EU. What safeguards are in place to protect us, especially when negotiations don't go our way?
Okay, fine. What did we join 40 years ago? What did my mum and dad's generation vote for 40 years ago? Tariff-free access to the European market. 40 years on, what we find is that tariffs across the world have come down because of globalization. And for the benefit of tariff-free access to a market that sells us more than we sell them, that regulates not just the 12% of the economy that sells to the EU, but the other 88% as well, gives us unlimited free movement of people and bans us making our own trade deals with the rest of the world. Frankly, the cost of membership now far outweighs any benefit. And do you know something? If those renegotiations went badly, let's say the worst case scenario, that the French and Germans decide to cut off their nose to spite their face with their, hang on, right, well, let's just say they decide to cut off their nose to spite their face with their biggest export market in the world. Do you know what? If they put tariffs on us, those tariffs will be significantly lower than our net financial contribution. So no deal is better than the rotten deal that we've got at the moment.
Heather,
And the reality, the reality, of course,
Allow her
is...
to come back on that,
yeah,
please,
sure.
Ms. Farage.
The President of the EU Commission, Jean-Paul Juncker, has already said that deserters will not be welcomed with open arms.
Isn't it lovely?
And that the UK...
Isn't it wonderful?
And that the UK will have to accept being regarded as a third country and will not be handled with kid gloves.
I don't want to be threatened.
The German Chancellor and the Prime Ministers of Spain and Netherlands
I'm sorry, we're British, we're better than that. We're not going to be bullied by anybody, least of all the unelected, charming though he may be, Jean-Claude Juncker. Forget it.
Thank you, Heather. We're going to go to another question now. Stephen Denison Smith has a question for Mr. Farage.
Yeah, Mr. Farage, you've maintained that wages are kept low by uncontrolled immigration in the UK, and that if we leave the EU, one of the benefits will be that wages will rise.
Yes.
Wouldn't it be so that increased wages will make us less competitive globally, and that isn't it far better that we allow wages to rise because we have a stronger economy and in Europe, rather than artificially restrict the supply of labour and boost labour rates that way?
Well, what we've done is we've artificially given our labour market a situation since 2004-05 where there's been a dramatic oversupply. That has driven down the cost of labour. That's just simple market forces, and indeed even the Bank of England, you know, have backed up the fact that for people on average salaries, their living standards are 10% lower than they were in 2008.
Yeah, if I can come back to you on that, what I'd say to you is that just artificially jacking this the cost environment in the UK up by restricting labour supply.
Well,
the problem you've got is that you've seen traditional industries move to other parts of the world to lower cost manufacturing environments, and simply if you make us more expensive to do business artificially, it's going to migrate.
Now, this is the argument of Lord Rose, who of course is the chairman of the Britain Stronger in Europe group, although appears to have gone into hibernation. And this may well be because when he appeared before the Treasury Select Committee, he was asked if Britain leaves the European Union, has a work permit system for foreign workers, wouldn't wages go up? He said yes, but I don't think that would be a good thing. Do you know something? There is more to this country. There is more about our community than just being competitive.
Artificially putting ourselves into an environment where we just make us...
I'm sorry, sir. What is artificial is to have opened up our doors to nearly 500 million people and to flood our labour market and to see some of the best,
but when
finest...
you or I are old and dribbling in our nursing home and needing somebody to mop up behind us, if you double the cost of that kind of work, what are you going to do?
I don't know. We're not saying double the cost, but we're saying significantly higher. And what I am saying to you is, I think it is wrong that for average, decent families in this country, their living standards have fallen by 10% over the course of the last few years. And it's about time, as a society, we started thinking not just about GDP figures, not just about the rich getting richer, but about ordinary, decent Britons who've got a rotten time.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the question too. We are going to now stay with immigration and go to Tola Jayolo, who has a question.
Nigel Farage, what I would like to know is how can you have the audacity to use such blatant scaremongering tactics for the Leave campaign? In light of the recent horrific sexual assaults in Germany, you have basically suggested that a vote to Remain is a vote for British women to be subdued to the same horrific assaults.
Well, just calm down there a little bit, all right?
Because
no. But I mean, sometimes in life, what it says at the top of a newspaper page and what you've actually said can be slightly different things. Look, I'm used to being demonised because I've taken on the establishment.
Demonising my
and I have just let me finish. And I have, when I first suggested we should have an Australian-style points system, I mean, you'd think I'd said something dreadful. And now I'm pleased to say lots of people are saying it.
I don't think that's what I asked.
What I said about Cologne was that it's a huge issue in Germany. It's a huge issue in Sweden. I think Angela Merkel has made a big mistake by saying, please anyone come. And what's happened is a very large number of young single males have settled in Germany and in Sweden who come from cultures where attitudes towards women are different. I haven't scaremongered in any way at all.
Are you not embarrassed that Justin Welby today said that you're legitimising racism?
Well, I'm sorry, and I'm not going to stand here and attack the Archbishop of Canterbury, but I think he would have done better to have read actually what I said and not what the headline was. And he would do well to see what the head of the Roman Catholic Church in Germany has said, because he's made some very robust comments.
But you're targeting a certain group of people and using them as bait to prey upon British people's rational fears about mass migration.
I'm sorry, this is an issue for the future. It is a tiddly little issue as far as I'm concerned in this election campaign. But I knew that at some point in this campaign, the Remainers would come for me and would try and conflate something I'd said out of all proportion.
May I just ask?
I do believe in border controls. I do believe we need to have a sensible, balanced migration policy, and I do believe Germany have made a bad mistake.
We're going to stay on this issue and go to Imriel Morgan alongside Tola there, and a question also for Mr. Farage.
Hi, Nigel. I know a lot of people, I have an access to a predominantly black British audience, and a lot of the concerns that they have raised alongside concerns that I have myself is that you are going to increase the fear and discrimination of black British people through your anti-immigration rhetoric.
Well,
are you encouraging racism in Britain?
I don't think you could be more wrong, and here's why.
Well, how are you going to safeguard that is essentially what I want to know.
And here's why. I take a very strongly pro-Commonwealth view. I think it was very bad and wrong of us to turn our backs on the Commonwealth in favour of a European political project, and we've made a bad mistake. So now what we do is, if you've got a qualification and you come from India or you come from parts of Africa, you now find it very, very difficult to get into this country despite the historical, strong...
You're still anti-immigration, so I don't
I'm sorry, I won't have that.
You are anti-immigration. You use scaremongering and inflammatory comments in your campaign that have gone against people that look non-white?
If you
How
really-
are non-white British people going to stop
you
facing
really wanna think
discrimination
that-
about their identity and nationality in this country? That is what I really want to know.
I'm sorry.
You haven't addressed my concerns.
Well, I tell you what, if you want to think that, and you
I
don't want
don't think that. That's the majority of people that look black, British, or non-white.
Well, lots of
have
them.
those concerns. They're very real
can I
concerns,
tell you?
and you're dismissing them.
Can I tell you that lots of them voted for my party in the last election?
Did they?
Stand for us as candidates?
Did they? Can I see the evidence?
And
on what numbers?
And you're not listening, are you?
How much of the 3% voted for you?
I can't do a lot unless I'm allowed
Well,
to
she's
talk.
put a very clear
now, look,
question to
Now,
you.
look, I'm explaining to you that I take a view that is strongly pro-Commonwealth. If we have an Australian-style point system rather than an open door to 508 million people, then actually it'll be better for black people coming into Britain who currently find it very difficult because we have this open door. And I would also say this to you, that once again, this attempt to demonise the Leave campaign or me, actually, there is big support for this amongst the ethnic minorities in this country who know that actually our current open border policy is damaging all of our communities. And here's our chance, maybe our one and only chance as a nation to get a grip on this issue.
Imriel, thank you very much indeed for your question. And we're now going to go to John Nightingale.
Mr. Farage, a number of high-profile studies have clearly shown that EU migrants contribute far more to the British economy than they take out. But so how can you constantly ignore these findings and continue to tell us that immigration is a disaster for the UK?
Well, we see reports that say that EU migrants pay more tax than they take out. I saw a report yesterday that suggested that actually it's a marginal loss for the country. I'll tell you what we'll do. I'll meet you in the middle. We'll agree with the House of Lords, who looked at this and said, in economic terms, it's probably about neutral, all right? But my argument is this. Mr. Cameron, who will come on afterwards, will tell you that it's a wonderful economic benefit. And despite his pledge in the general election of reducing immigration to tens of thousands a year, he now says it would be disastrous for our economy. The real truth is that the population of this country is rising at a number where we need to value people's quality of life and standard of living and not just national GDP figures. If immigration continues at the current rate, our population will be 80 million by 2040. And just to cope with that, do you know we need to build a new house every 4 minutes, night and day, just to cope with the current numbers. So what I'm saying to you is, let's have a balanced approach.
Let me tell you that we, as you well know, have an ageing population here, that we are going to need migrants to pay our pensions, to pay for hospitals, to pay for the NHS, although all that is going to be necessary. That if you think you can actually stop people coming in here, if you persuade our country to leave the European Union, and then you find, in fact, every European country that wants to trade in the free market has to have free movement of people, what are you going to do in 2 years' time? And then are you going to ask to join again?
You're bringing something else in here. Look, nowhere else in the world, apart from the EU, is the argument made that to trade with each other, you need to have free movement of people. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the world.
But it does in the EU, and we live in Europe.
The Americans sell more into the European Union market than we do. They are not members of the European Union, they don't have a trade deal with the European Union, and they most certainly don't have free movement of people.
Every European country that is not in the EU but wants to trade with the EU has to have free movement.
But it doesn't have to have free movement, and actually the Swiss have just voted against it, as you well know.
John Nightingale, thank you very much indeed for that. We're going to move on because we want to cover some more topics. I'm going to turn now to Dominic Rath, who has a question on law and order and security.
According to the director of Europol, law enforcement in the UK gains increasing security benefits from our EU membership. Given this and the fact a number of former police chiefs have stated it would have a negative impact, wouldn't it be a huge backward step for our security to leave the EU? How are you going to assure our safety isn't compromised if we leave?
Well, and again, it's the same debate, isn't it? Some people say that it's much better to be with the European Union, and they tend to be the people who are currently employed.
And then you say former
and then you
chiefs?
and then you get Sir Richard Dearlove, the former boss of MI6, who says actually it's a very dangerous place for us to be. Look, I take this very simple view. You quoted Europol, at me. That same boss of Europol said that the migrant policy, and by the way, these are not refugees, they're mostly economic migrant policy over the last year, sparked by Angela Merkel, as we discussed earlier, has led to up to 5,000 jihadis coming in to the European Union in the space of the last 15 months. The former boss of Interpol said, we may as well put a sign on the southern beaches of Europe saying, terrorists welcome. So we have a very real problem. Now, the question is, how do we deal with issues like this? The first point that I think is really, really important is this. This should be a British passport. It says European Union on it, all right? I think to make this country safer, we need to get back British passports so that we can check anybody else coming in to this country.
Can we allow Mr. Ruff back in?
I really do.
I completely agree on your border control point, but what I'm talking about with our security is not just about that. And you've got to put terrorism aside. Terrorism accounts for some tiny proportion of the cases that our police are involved with around Europe. You've got stuff like Europol, you've got Eurojust, the European warrant, you've got the convention which allows the databases to be set up to change. If we leave, all of them are going to be taken out under the European. There's also, I work in card fraud. You have the SEPA arrangement where card fraud losses are much lower under that than in outside SEPA, which is the single European payment area. There are all these reasons that aren't actually terrorist or immigrant related. So when you're talking security, I think our police have a lot more involvement, and we're also the leading people in Europe that have caused a huge number of changes.
But here's the point,
Dominic's got a lot to get off his
I know he has. I know he has.
Be very brief, because I need to move on.
I'll be very brief. Okay, there are two approaches to this. One is that as a sovereign nation, we cooperate and we exchange information with our friends and neighbours, just as we do with the Americans. But no one says we have to become the 51st state of America to do this. I suggest we do this as a sovereign nation, not give away the authority to this to Brussels or any agency.
We should say also the director of Europol is in favour of remaining.
Yes, he is. But he's equally criticised their own policy.
We've already got a lot of intelligence areas. Sorry to come in, but we've already got a lot of intelligence to do with terrorism outside. The ones within the European Union aren't in that vein, and I don't think you can pass them in the same way. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Okay, we're going to speak now and hear from Joanna Stambridge, who has a question about sovereignty. Joanna.
Hi. Even if we left the EU, we're still going to be members of a whole lot of international organisations.
I hope so.
World Trade Organisation, the UN, the IMF, all sorts of different organisations, all of which involve sovereignty trade-off to some extent. So would leaving the EU really establish UK sovereignty, or is it a bit of an emotional red herring?
Okay. You mentioned the World Trade Organization. We have no vote on the World Trade Organization. When international trade's being discussed, Britain, and sometimes we're asked even to leave the room, because we've given away the ability to do that to an unelected bureaucrat based in Brussels.
Can I just because I'm not sure who's unelected. That's something that I keep hearing.
The European commissioners are unelected, they are appointed, and they have the sole right to propose legislation within the European Union.
Can I again stop, because my understanding is the European commissioners are appointed by elected representatives and have to be appointed
we cannot vote.
by
Mr.
the
Juncker, Mr. Juncker was the charming Mr. Juncker who's been threatening us was mentioned earlier.
Okay.
We can't vote for him, we can't remove him.
Thank
Sovereignty.
you. Thank you very much.
We live in an interdependent world. But the point about this referendum, this is a referendum for us to vote to get our independence as a nation.
Thank you.
And that means we make our own laws in our own parliaments, our own courts are the ultimate arbiters, and we can then trade and make our own decisions.
We just want to get one more question in, please. Forgive me for interrupting there. Mr. Grimwood, Dave Grimwood, you have a question.
Thank you. We've been told that this referendum is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. I'm interested to know what you think the EU will look like in 20 years' time if we stay in it.
Well, I think it's done for, frankly. I think the Eurozone is a catastrophe. Just look at what they've done to Greece and those Mediterranean countries. The migrant crisis is now not just dividing countries, but dividing within countries, leading to a whole new brand of politics. The money's run out, and yet, at the same time, they're saving up for the day after our referendum, their announcements about a European army and about an increased European budget. The project doesn't work. I want us to get back our independence, but to say we'll be good Europeans. We'll trade with Europe, cooperate with Europe, but govern ourselves. And I believe when we do that, the rest of Europe will do that too. And a happy Europe will be a democratic Europe of sovereign states who are good neighbours in the same street. That's where I want to get us to.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I need to stop you there, Mr. Farage, and thank you so far to all our questioners and to you too, Mr. Farage.
Thank you.
And we will let you take your leave from us.
Thank you.
And we're going to take a short break now. When we come back, David Cameron will be here to take more questions from our audience, so do please stay with us for that. Hello and welcome back. Well, in the first half of our programme, we heard the leader of the UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage, put forward his case for why he believes we should leave the EU. Now, David Cameron, who wants us to stay, is his turn to face our studio audience. Welcome, Mr. Cameron. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome to you, Mr. Cameron, and we'll go straight to our first question, and it is from Robert Newman.
Mr. Cameron, you and the Remain camp seem to be convinced that if Britain leaves the EU, that we will be plunged into recession. 6 months ago, you told the CBI that Britain could survive outside the EU. Why are you now so adamant that we'll be plunged into economic meltdown if we decide to leave?
Well, we can certainly survive outside the EU. I think the question for us is, how do we thrive? How do we do best? How do we create opportunities and jobs and chances for our children and our grandchildren? That, to me, is what this debate is about. And I think what's so unique about it is the extraordinary consensus. 9 out of 10 economists, the Governor of the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund, all saying that they believe we would suffer a hit to our economy, a hit to jobs. And what that means for people is lower living standards, potentially lower wages, higher prices in our shops, and yes, potentially a recession. And I think it would be irresponsible for me, as your Prime Minister, not to warn of these things. After all, the IMF, the OECD, some of these bodies are actually paid to warn Prime Ministers when their economies face risks. So yes, we could find a way, but in my view, it's not the right way. And I want to, if I can, just take a moment to say why all these experts, I believe, are right. And it's to do with this single market, 500 million people. It's where we sell half of the goods and services that we export, almost half. And of course, if we have less good access to that market, our economy will be smaller. There will be fewer opportunities. That's why I think the experts are right. I think we should listen to their opinions, and I think we should vote to remain on June the 23rd.
Robert, would you like to come back on that?
You refer to, we have a Treasury which didn't forecast a credit crunch. Yep. We have a Home Office which predicted that only 16,000 people would come over for Eastern Europe. The last time anybody counted, 1.6 million had already arrived.
I accept forecasters don't always get it right, but I can't remember a time when you've had such a consensus of all these bodies and all these economists. And as I say, what they're saying makes common sense to me, because if you're a great trading nation, and we are a great trading nation, and if you cut yourself off from your most important market and have worse terms in that market, then you're going to be disadvantaged. Now, what Nigel Farage said was that multinational companies or others wouldn't reduce their investments in Britain. But let's take, for instance, the car industry, a fantastic success in our country, 150,000 people employed in it, another 300,000 helping to supply it. If we had the same situation as America, which was what Mr. Farage was talking about, our cars would face a 10% tariff, a 10% tax. And that's why I think you'd see less investment and less jobs. So I think there's a real consensus now that we'd be worse off if we were to leave.
Mr. Cameron, thank you. Forgive me for moving on. We've got lots to get through.
Sure.
We're going to take a question now from Anthony Gould.
Prime Minister, you gave an excellent speech in 2013 outlining the minimum reforms that you wanted to get from the EU. One of the key ones from my perspective, running a small business, was that you wanted to remove the free movement of people so that we could recruit skilled people from all over the world, not baristas from the EU. You were basically humiliated on that. So why on earth are you now saying that the EU is wonderful? You were saying then you'd leave if you didn't get those reforms.
What I said in the reforms that I sought, I said we need it to be less of a single currency club. So I wanted guarantees for the pound, our currency, and I got those. I said I wanted it to be less bureaucratic. So I wanted targets to cut regulation, including on small businesses, and I got that. I said that I wanted to make sure it was less of a political union for us. I think we're there for trade and cooperation and working together, but we want to live in a country called Great Britain and be part of a European Union. And so I've got us out of ever closer union. And crucially, on migration and the movement of people, I said I didn't think it was right that people could come to our country and immediately take out of the benefit system, including the in-work benefit system. And what I've secured is this idea, this proposal, that if people come here, first of all, they can't claim unemployment benefit. If they don't have a job within 6 months, they have to go home. And if they do work here, and many people do work here and make a great contribution, but if they do work here, they don't get full access to our welfare system until they've worked here for 4 years. Now, I think that is a real advance for us, because it's no more something for nothing. It's saying, yes, come here and work, come here and contribute, but you have to pay in before you get out.
Mr. Gould, would you like to come back on that?
But if you need skilled people from outside the EU, it's devilish difficult. I've even had to spend thousands of pounds, wait over a year to get a Tier 2 visa for my staff to come here. It's ridiculous when somebody can walk in here and do the most junior, unskilled job from the EU. We can't get the skilled people we need from anywhere where we need them.
Well, obviously, the control of immigration, I'm sure we'll talk about it tonight, is an important issue. It's an important challenge. And one of the ways we try and control it from the rest of the world is we say that we should do more to train our own people here to do the jobs that the British economy is delivering. And so what we have is if there's a shortage of a particular occupation, we say to business, okay, you can go and seek that from overseas. But what I want to see is more apprenticeships, more people going to university, more young people trained to do the jobs that our economy is creating. And that actually is probably the best way of reducing immigration and making sure there are jobs and livelihoods for our people.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Cameron. We're going to stay indeed with that issue of immigration now. We have a question for you from Harry Bapari.
Hi, Harry.
I have no GP as all are full in my area. I can't get onto the housing ladder and have 3 kids in one room. The place where I grew up was a lovely area, but is now a no-go zone. How is the EU and uncontrolled immigration working for me, a 40-year-old Brit who has been working full-time since the age of 16?
Well, what I'd say is I think there are good ways of controlling immigration, and I think there are bad ways of controlling immigration. A good way is what I just explained, of saying that people can come here, they can work, they can contribute, but they have to pay in before they get out. And when it comes to immigration from outside the EU, which of course is more than half, we do put a limit on the numbers that come for economic reasons. But I would say, really frankly, that I think if we want to build houses, if we want to invest in our health service, if we want good schools for our children, we've got to strengthen and safeguard our economy. And pulling out of the single market, which is what the Leave campaign want to do, that would damage our economy. Nigel Farage said it. He kept on talking about GDP isn't all that matters. GDP is the size of our economy. It's the combination of all the wealth that our country creates. He's basically saying it doesn't really matter. He's so keen to get us out of Europe that he's prepared to sacrifice jobs and growth on the way. We mustn't do that. That's not the way to build houses or provide the health service we need.
With respect, Mr. Cameron, I voted for you in the last election because one of the things on your manifesto was to get immigration down. You haven't been able to do that because you're not allowed to do that. That's the bottom line. So how are you, I can see my standard of living and my family's standard of living going down because of this influx that we can't control. Now, I'm sorry to say, but your closing statement last week was that if we leave the EU, we're rolling a dice with our children's future. I think quite the opposite. By you telling us to stay in, you've rolled that dice already.
Well, obviously, Obviously, I don't agree with that. I think the biggest risk we can take is to pull out of the EU, pull out of the single market, damage our businesses, damage jobs, and there'll be fewer opportunities for our children and grandchildren. And I say again, I hope that when people go to vote on June the 23rd, they think about their children and grandchildren. They think about the jobs and the opportunities they want for them, the sort of country that we want to build together, and they vote to say, we don't want little England of Nigel Farage. We want to be Great Britain, and we're great if we stay in these organisations and fight for the sort of values we believe in.
We want to stay on this issue of pressure on services and immigration. Mr. Cameron, we have a question to you on the NHS from Shania Dennis.
Mr. Cameron, I don't have to tell you that the NHS is under immense pressure. We currently do not have enough resources for the demand from the service users. If we remain in the EU, what plans do you have to deal with the pressures of migrants on the NHS and its workers?
Well, first of all, I think if we stay in the EU and we keep our economy strong, that's the absolute key to providing a strong NHS. And that's why the head of the National Health Service, Simon Stevens, said it's only with a strong economy that you can keep putting money and resources into the NHS. On this issue of migration, I absolutely agree. It is a challenge, but I don't think it's a challenge we should meet by damaging our economy. And as we think about it, I think we should also think about the 50,000 EU nationals that work in our NHS. Very often you'll find the people...
We don't need EU nationals to work in the NHS. We've got enough skilled people in the NHS. If that was your main concern, you wouldn't be taking away the funding for the nurses, for students to go and study nursing. My issue is what plans are we going to have in place so that people can get MRI scans when they need to, so that I don't have to let down people on a day-to-day basis. We're really under-resourced. So as much as it's nice that they can bring over doctors and nurses, what resources, what facilities can you put in place to ensure that we can deal with this high demand?
Well, what we're going to put in is an extra 12 billion in this parliament into the NHS. But I would just make
12 billion towards what? We keep on hearing
12 billion towards making sure that we meet waiting times, not just for cancer, but also for mental health. Making sure we've got...
Cancer. I just want to say, me and my co-workers, we're doing our part. We're providing excellent patient care.
Thank you.
You need to do your part and provide us with the right resources.
No,
Thank you. Let's leave it there. Mr. Cameron, we're going to leave it there, please, because I want to get another question in. And we've got a question now for you from Stuart John Channon.
Mr. Cameron, you went to the EU to reform our membership and get a better deal. Do you share my frustration that EU citizens are still able to come into the UK and claim benefits? And what assurances can you give us that if we stay, you will look for further reform?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. Reform doesn't end on June the 23rd. If we vote to stay in, we should keep reforming this organisation. But I would say, and I think it's really important, I think we do have a special status in the EU already. We're not in the euro. We've got our own currency. We're not in the no border zone. We've kept our own borders. We're now going to be out of the ever closer union proposal. So our membership is right for Britain. It gives us the trade. It gives us the cooperation. It helps us work with other countries to get what we want. Now, in terms of reform, I think the things I secured do really help us. They safeguard our currency. It means we can't be discriminated against. They make sure that there are targets for cutting the regulations on business that people can find frustrating. And so, yes, the reform goes on. But of course, if we leave, the reform ends. And here's what really happens if we leave. Of course, we'd still want to sell into that single market. So we'd still have to meet all the rules and the regulations that Brussels lays down, but we won't be at the table. We'll be like a country with our ear and our face pressed up against the glass, trying to find out what's happening with the other 27 countries, making rules that affect our country. And I would say that is no way for the fifth biggest country, biggest economy in the world to behave. We need to be in this organisation, fighting for British interests and for British jobs. Leaving is quitting. And I don't think we're quitters. I think we're fighters. We fight in these organisations for what we think is right.
Surely when you went for that deal, that was the opportunity to say, I've got this referendum coming. This is my opportunity to get the deal that will be right for Britain. But you weren't able to achieve that. Well, I don't see how we're going to be able to achieve that later on down the line.
Well, sir, you mentioned specifically the issue of benefits. And one of my key demands, which I got, was to say, if you come here, you don't get unemployment benefit. If you haven't got a job after 6 months, you have to leave. It is the free movement to come and work, but it's not the free movement to come and live off someone else's taxpayers. And uniquely in Britain, you're going to have to work here for 4 years, paying into the system, contributing to our economy before you get full access to our welfare system. Okay. I think that is a really good proposal, and one, of course, that we only get if we stay. If we leave, reform is over, and I worry for what would happen to our economy and the jobs and the livelihoods of people, which I think is the most important thing in this referendum.
Mr. Cameron, thank you very much indeed. And just on a point of information on that, by how many figures do you expect the migration from the EU to fall as a result of the reform that you secured?
I haven't made a forecast because, frankly, we've had pretty extraordinary years recently in the European Union. In the first 5 years I was Prime Minister, our economy created more jobs than the rest of the European Union put together. And so we have seen a lot of people coming to live and coming to work here. Actually, 9 out of 10 people in work are British nationals. 2/3 of the jobs created since I've been Prime Minister have been British people taking those jobs. So I'm not going to make a forecast, but I think it stands to sense. If today you can come in from the EU and get £10,000 of tax credits on top of your wages, and I'm saying you're not going to have that in future, clearly that will make a difference.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Cameron, for taking that point. And we get a question now on sovereignty from James Esses.
Mr. Cameron, we recently celebrated the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. The United Kingdom has been built on the pillars of democracy, and we have the greatest legal system in the world. Is it not shameful that since joining the EU, our parliament is no longer sovereign, our Supreme Court is no longer supreme, and our nation is no longer self-governing?
Well, so what I would say, first of all, I think we're engaged in the greatest act of national sovereignty that we've had for many years, a referendum where not the politicians, but the people will decide whether we stay in this organisation or whether we leave. And I would say, having been your Prime Minister for the last 6 years, Parliament is sovereign. We've just had a Queen's speech with a whole set of proposals and measures, some of which you might agree with and some of which you might disagree with, but they're British proposals for the British people from a British government. Now, you hear a lot of talk about patriotism in this referendum. As far as I'm concerned, I love this country with a passion. I think we're an amazing country. And I say if you love your country, then you don't damage its economy. You don't restrict opportunities for young people. You don't actually isolate your country and reduce its influence in the world. And frankly, I do worry about a second Scottish referendum if we vote to leave, and you don't strengthen your country by leading to its breakup. So I'm deeply patriotic. I think this is a case for a bigger, greater Britain inside a European Union. And let me go directly to this point about... Sorry, please do.
Your own House of Commons library has estimated that up to 55% of our laws are made by Europe, i.e. unelected bureaucrats, and we also are in the position that our own Supreme Court judges can be overruled by European judges, some of whom may never have even stepped foot in this country. It's a disgrace.
What I would say is, to me, what really matters, true sovereignty is about control. Do you have control over your country's destiny? We're a trading nation. We need access to the single market. If we leave, it still exists, the EU still exists, we have to sell into that market. We'd have to obey every single one of the rules and regulations to sell into that market, but we'd have no say over what they are. Let's take the car industry again. I want to make sure we're around that table writing the rules for electric cars. I want us to be the leader. I want us to be the winners in Europe and in the world when it comes to technologies like this. And we don't enhance our influence by walking away or quitting. We reduce our influence. So it might give you the illusion of sovereignty to withdraw on June the 23rd, but you'd find out in area after area after area, things that affect our great country, we would have no say over. When we want to try and make sure Iran can't get a nuclear weapon, when we want to be strong in front of Putin's aggression in the Ukraine, we need to work in these organizations. We need to work in NATO. We need to work in the UN. And yes, we need to work in the EU. Sometimes it can drive me mad, right? It is a bureaucracy. It is frustrating. But I honestly believe walking away, quitting, would reduce our national influence, would reduce our economy, would reduce our say in the world, and as a result would damage our country.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Thank you also to James for your question. And we have a question now also on similar issues from Joseph Cook.
Mr. Cameron, I know that we're all meant to elect our local MEP, but every time I ask my customers coming into my shop, who is your MEP, not one of them has got a clue. None. Now, that is shameful on our part, and it's shameful that the EU isn't reaching out where it should be. We just don't know who they are. We've got not a clue. And that is, I've been asked, especially with the referendum coming up, I've asked many of them, so many of them, and not one knows. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't want the European Parliament or the European Union to have more power. I want the power to reside in our Parliament. And if this is an important point, I think, for people who are concerned about the future, if there's any proposal to pass further powers from our Parliament to Brussels, automatically there has to be a referendum. So there's a lock on whether more powers can be passed. Does Brussels need reform? Yes. Do these institutions need opening up? Yes. Can it be frustrating sometimes? Of course it can. But the question we've got to ask ourselves in this referendum is not, do I like the European Parliament? Frankly, I don't like it very much. The question we've got to ask ourselves, are we better off? Are we stronger? Are we safer if we stay in this organisation or if we leave? That's the question on the ballot paper. And I hope people, I'm sure, will share many of my frustrations about the European Union, but frustrations with an institution or indeed with a relationship are often not a justification for walking away. They're an argument for staying and fighting for what you need for jobs, for investment, for security for our country.
Joseph, thank you very much indeed for that question. We're going to press on a question on law and order from Peter Thompson.
Mr Cameron, just today we have seen yet more evidence of the type of crimes committed by EU nationals who have records in their home country and come here to commit more crimes. If we remain in the EU, how can we protect the public from the EU nationals who have committed offences in our home countries?
Peter, very good question. I can answer it very specifically. First of all, we will keep our border controls. We can stop anyone at our border, EU nationals included, and if we think they're a risk to our country, we don't have to let them in. And in my renegotiation, I strengthened that to give us more freedom to do that. First point. Second point, we've got a lot of European and other foreign nationals in our prisons. And one of my greatest frustrations as Prime Minister is going around to some of these countries, whether it's going to Nigeria or Jamaica or Pakistan, and trying to get foreign nationals out of our prisons and over to the countries where they came from. In Europe, we do at least have a directive on prisoner transfers, which is now coming into force, and we'll be able to get those people out of our prisons so they can be paid for by the governments whose citizens they are. Now, if we leave, we'll be back to the situation that we had before, far, far more difficult to get these people out of our country. Please come back.
The 50 names and individuals that were released today in the press, you, the government, tried to get them out of the country because they've committed serious offences, but Brussels said no, they have to remain.
But that's because...
So how can we deal with that issue?
Because of this prisoner transfer agreement is not yet fully in force.
So when will that be?
It is coming in the coming months. So we're going to see we've already seen some go, and we're going to see a lot more go. But the certainty is this: if we leave and we're outside these directives, we'll be back to the situation we have with other countries on the other side of the world, where it can take months, it can take years, it can sometimes take decades. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, I expect some of us are old enough to remember, when inside Europe, people could flee Britain and go to the Costa del Crime in Spain, and it would take us decades to get them back. Just one more point, I promise I'll come back to you. Because of the European arrest warrant, we can now get people back. 1,100 murderers, rapists and criminals have been brought back to Britain and face justice in our courts because of that. And we lose it if we go.
Why are they entering the UK in the first place? I understand the European arrest warrant, and that's great, taken back to their own country to face justice. But why are they entering the UK in the first place?
Well, they shouldn't, and that's why we keep our borders, and my renegotiation means that we have more freedom to stop people coming in the first place. Leave, and those things go.
Okay, thank you both, Peter and Mr Cameron, for the response to that. And we will leave another question with Mr David Greenwood, who's with us again.
Thank you. Mr Cameron, win or lose this referendum, are you finished as Prime Minister? And...
Oh, I thought it was a pretty frank one already.
And if you do lose, what does Britain look like in 20 years' time?
Right. First of all, this is a vote of the British people. Your votes all count equally. It's not a vote for the politicians. And what I've said, having promised this referendum, having arranged this referendum, I've said I would accept your instructions. And I think it's very important that people's individual careers and future don't get caught up in this vote. I want everyone to focus very clearly on the choice. And the choice you've heard tonight. Do you go with Nigel Farage and the Leave team? You put jobs at risk, you potentially shrink our economy? Or do you go with this extraordinary alliance of Greens and Liberals and the Labour Party, a Conservative government, the trade unions, business large and small, and put our differences aside and stay in this organisation for the good of our country? That's the choice. And that's not about my future, that's about the country's future. As for what I think this organisation will look like, did you mean if we stay or if we leave? Which one?
If you lose the argument and we leave the EU, what will Britain look like in 20 years' time?
Just 10 seconds answer, please.
I worry if we leave that we're going to see our economy suffer because we're going to lose access to the absolutely vital market that we have. And I would say the right thing to do, the British thing to do, is to fight for a Great Britain inside a European Union and don't take the Nigel Farage Little England option. That's not the country we want, it's not the country we want for our children, and I don't think it's right for our country. So I hope we vote to remain on June the 23rd.
Cameron, thank you very much indeed. And there we must leave it. Thank you very much indeed, David Cameron. Well, we have heard from David Cameron and from Nigel Farage, both putting forward their arguments, but the decision, of course, will ultimately be yours. when the polls open on June the 23rd. And if you haven't already done so, you've got just 2 hours left to register to vote. You can do that online at the address on screen now. In 2 days' time, on Thursday the 9th, I'll be hosting the ITV referendum debate with 6 key figures from the Leave and Remain camps. Stay with us now on ITV for reaction and analysis on News at 10. Thanks very much to everybody for all of your questions. Thanks to you at home for watching. Good night.